You're listening to Cowboy Ember, where every story carries the glow of a flame that refuses to die. Tales from the Old West, about love that starts in the dust and rises to the stars, about the fierce bonds between people who choose each other when the world gives them nothing, and the quiet compassion that makes us human. If your heart beats for these stories, welcome home. He had 70 days to find a wife, or lose 2,000 acres his family had bled for over 20 years. She had one trunk, $0, and a heart shattered by a man who forgot to mention he was already married. When a desperate rancher sat down across from a heartbroken stranger in a Nevada saloon and said, "I need a wife, and I'm not pretending this is about love." She should have walked away. Instead, she shook his hand. What grew from that handshake will leave you breathless. Do not leave before the end. This story reminds us that the most extraordinary love doesn't always begin with a spark. Sometimes it begins with a handshake, a deal, and two people brave enough to let something real grow from something practical. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Now let's ride.
That telegram showed up on what was shaping up to be the worst day of Russell Whitmore's life. He wouldn't know until much later that it was also his salvation. He was standing inside the lawyer's office there in Reno, Nevada, worrying the brim of his worn-out hat while Mr. Piton Reed laid out the terms of his daddy's will with all the feeling of a blue norther blowing down from the mountains. It was March of 1882. And winter was still holding on tight. "Your father's wishes are plain as day," the lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "The ranch becomes yours, but only if you get married within 90 days of his passing. If you're still a bachelor after that, the whole property gets auctioned off. The money goes to the territorial government to build roads and such." Russell's jaw went hard as a rock. His father had been gone for 3 weeks, which gave him about 10 weeks to find a wife or watch 20 years of his family's sweat and tears get sold to the highest bidder. The Whitmore Ranch was a sprawling 2,000 acres of Nevada high country, blessed with mountain streams that never went dry, and enough good grass to run 500 head of cattle. It was a place worth fighting for, worth giving anything for, but finding a wife in 70 days felt like trying to rope the moon. "Did he give a reason why?" Russell asked, though he had a pretty good idea. His father wanted to make sure the family name carried on. Peon replied, "Your daddy was a practical man. He figured a ranch needs a family to truly prosper, not just some lone man working the land." Russell walked out of that office with his thoughts roiling like a thunderhead over the peaks. At 28 years old, his whole life had been spent working that ranch right alongside his father. Finding a woman had always been a thing for later, after the hard work was done. Well, later had just struck him like a bolt of lightning, and he was caught completely flat-footed. He headed down Virginia Street, past the noisy saloons and gambling parlors that put Reno on the map, past the train depot where folks with big dreams and empty pockets poured into the territory. The town had been booming lately, full of miners, cowboys, and all sorts of people looking for a lucky break in the desert. Surely, Russell thought, in this whole town, there had to be one person who needed what he had to offer. That night he found himself in the Golden Sage Saloon, staring into a whiskey he couldn't even taste, when he heard two women talking at the table next to him. One was Marjorie Keene, who owned the place with her husband. The other was a young lady Russell had never laid eyes on before. This stranger had hair the color of dark honey, all pinned up under a plain bonnet. Even in the dim lantern light, he could see she was plumb worn out. "You've been mighty kind, Mrs. Keene, but I can't be a burden on you any longer," the young woman said. She spoke proper like folks do back east. "I've been here 3 days now, and I have to find a job or a room I can pay for." "Oh, hush now, child. You're welcome to stay upstairs as long as you need," Marjorie answered. But there was a but in her voice that you could hear a mile away. "Though I'll be honest, good work for a woman on her own is hard to come by in Reno. Most decent jobs want letters of reference, and with your situation..." The young woman's shoulders slumped. I understand. I'll find something. I have to. Before he'd rightly thought it through, Russell found himself on his feet and walking over to their table. Both women looked up, surprised, as he took off his hat and held it in his hands. "Ma'am, forgive me for butting in," he said. "My name is Russell Whitmore. I've got a ranch north of here, and I couldn't help but hear you were looking for work, miss." The young woman's eyes went wide. They were a startling shade of gray-green, the color of sagebrush right after a good rain. "I am Mr. Whitmore. My name is Hannah Erickson." "Miss Erickson just got here from Boston last week," Marjorie jumped in to explain. Her eyes lit up with a sudden new interest. "She came out here to get married, but the fellow she came for turned out to be a low-down liar about his life." Hannah's face turned pink. "He already had a wife. She was the one who met me at the door of what was supposed to be my new home." A hot flash of anger shot through Russell for a man he didn't even know. What kind of snake would trick a woman like that? "That's a dirty shame. I'm truly sorry you were treated so poorly." "Thank you," Hannah said, her voice soft. "But kind words don't fill an empty stomach. I used just about every penny I had for the train ticket out west, and I have no way of getting back to Boston. Not that there's anything for me to go back to." Russell pulled a chair over and sat, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was pure foolishness, he knew, but it also felt like the good Lord himself had a hand in it. "Miss Erickson, I've got a proposition for you. It's going to sound a bit outlandish, but I'm asking you to just hear the whole thing before you say no." Hannah looked at Marjorie, who gave a little nod, so she turned back to him. "All right." "I'm in need of a wife," Russell said straight out. "My father passed, and his will says I have to be married within 90 days or I lose the ranch. I've got 10 weeks left. You're in need of a home and a way to get by. What I'm proposing is a marriage that's more of a business arrangement. You'd have a good roof over your head, plenty to eat, and everything you need. In exchange, you would run the household and help me with the ranch's books. My foreman's wife, Maria, lives on the ranch with her family, so you wouldn't be all alone out there or without another woman to talk to." The words came spilling out of him, and he watched her face change from surprise to disbelief, and then to something that looked like she was actually thinking it over. "You're asking to marry a woman you just met 5 minutes ago," Hannah stated, her voice flat. "I am proposing a deal to a woman who needs what I have, just like I need what you have," Russell clarified. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is about love, Miss Erickson. But it would be an honest arrangement that helps us both. You would be the lady of the house, in charge of everything inside it. I am not a mean man, and I give you my solemn promise I would always treat you with respect." Marjorie was watching them both, practically buzzing with excitement. "Hannah, honey, you could do a whole lot worse. The Whitmore Ranch is a fine place, and everyone knows Russell here is a square shooter and a good man." Hannah sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table. Russell could practically see the gears turning in her head as she weighed her choices, which probably all looked pretty terrible. At last she met his gaze with those incredible eyes and asked, "What exactly would you require from me in this arrangement, Mr. Whitmore? I want you to be completely honest." "I would need you to look after the house, which is a main ranch house with 6 rooms, Russell answered. "That means cooking, although Maria often pitches in when we have a big crew to feed. It also means keeping the books and making sure we're stocked up, since you're clearly smart enough to handle that. And you would need to be seen as my wife by everyone, so I can meet the terms of the will. Besides that, I just expect common decency and for us to get along. That's all." "That's all," Hannah repeated quietly, and he knew right away what she was really asking. "I would not lay a hand on you unless you wanted me to," Russell said, looking her straight in the eye. "You'd have your own room. If anything more than a business deal ever happens between us, it would be because we both wanted it to." Hannah was silent for a long moment, her finger tracing the edge of her coffee cup. When she finally looked up, her voice was strong, even though he could see her hands were trembling. "I left Boston because I had nothing left there. My parents passed from a fever last year, and I don't have any brothers or sisters. The man I was supposed to marry there called off the wedding when he found out my father's debts ate up my inheritance. I came out here hoping for a new beginning, only to get fooled again. I'm just tired of other people's lies and bad luck running my life. I'm being honest with you, Russell said gently. This isn't a fairy tale. This is about surviving for the both of us. But it's an honest way to do it. Hannah lifted her chin with a kind of pride that made Russell's heart skip a beat. All right, Mr. Whitmore, I accept your proposal. When does this need to happen? As soon as we can manage, Russell admitted. That deadline from my father is coming up fast. Tomorrow, then, Hannah said with a nod. I suppose there's a preacher in Reno who can handle the ceremony. Oh, Reverend Matthews down at the Presbyterian Church can get you all fixed up in no time, Marjorie offered, clearly delighted. I'm sure he could fit you in tomorrow afternoon. A wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees washed over Russell, followed by sheer panic. He was really going through with this. He was about to marry a total stranger to save his ranch. Tomorrow afternoon it is. Then, Miss Erickson, I'll get you a room at the hotel next door for tonight, and I'll settle the bill. I'll come get you at noon tomorrow, and we can go talk to the Reverend. That will work, Hannah agreed. She held her hand out to him over the table. Russell shook it, and her hand felt small in his, with skin too soft for the hard country she was getting herself into. He had a sinking feeling she had no earthly idea what she was truly signing up for. That night, Russell found no sleep in his room above the Mercantile. He just lay there, staring up at the ceiling and wondering what in the world had led him to this point. He was about to marry a woman, and he barely even knew her last name. Her past was a closed book, and her personality was a complete mystery. It was the kind of move a desperate man would make, and he figured that's exactly what he was. But then he'd close his eyes and see her sage green eyes, looking back at him with a grit that matched his own desperation. And he thought, maybe, just maybe, this whole crazy thing might work out. The next day broke clear and cold. You could still see the last bit of winter holding on to the mountain peaks from Reno. Russell put on his best suit, a charcoal gray wool that was tailored for him in San Francisco 3 years ago and still fit pretty well. Years of ranch work had put some solid muscle on his shoulders, making the suit a little tight, but it would have to do for a wedding, especially one as strange as this. He got to the hotel right at noon and found Hannah waiting in the lobby. She was wearing a simple dress, a deep blue calico with a white collar, and her hair was tied back in a neat bun. She looked pale but calm. When she saw him, she offered a small smile that didn't quite seem genuine. Miss Erickson, he said, offering her his arm. Are you ready? I suppose I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Mr. Whitmore, she answered, taking his arm. He could feel her hand trembling just a little on his sleeve. They walked over to the Presbyterian Church without saying a word, each lost in their own world of thoughts. Reverend Matthews, a kind man in his 60s with a full head of white hair, met them at the door looking worried. Russell, are you sure about this? He asked in a low voice. Marriage is a sacred thing, son, not something to be taken lightly. I am sure, Reverend, Russell said, his voice firm. Miss Erickson and I have talked it all through, and we both agree this is what we need to do. The Reverend looked over at Hannah, and she gave a slow nod. This is my choice, Reverend Matthews. I am going into this marriage by my own free will. Very well, the Reverend sighed. Let's get on with it then. Do you have any witnesses? Just then, Marge Gary Keene came bustling in with her husband Frank. They were both grinning from ear to ear, acting like this was the greatest romance they had ever seen instead of a hurried deal between two strangers. We'll be the witnesses, Marjorie declared. Every wedding needs witnesses. The ceremony itself was short and to the point. Russell said his vows in a steady voice, promising to honor and protect Hannah for as long as they both should live. Hannah's voice only shook a tiny bit when she promised to honor and support Russell. When the Reverend said they were now husband and wife, Russell leaned over and gave her a quick kiss, just a light touch of his lips on hers. It was just a formality, but it felt strangely personal at the same time. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," Reverend Matthews said, though you could tell he still wasn't completely sold on the idea. They signed the marriage certificate with Marjorie and Frank signing on as their witnesses, and just like that, Russell was a married man. He had a wife, and he would get to keep his ranch. But as they walked out into the bright Nevada sunshine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made his life more complicated than he could possibly imagine. "I have a wagon waiting for us," Russell said. "The ranch is about an hour's ride north of here. Do you have any things to pick up?" "Just one trunk," Hannah said. "Everything I have in this world fits inside that one trunk." The quiet, accepting way she said that made something tighten up in Russell's chest. It was a feeling he wasn't used to. He went and got her trunk from the hotel, loaded it onto the wagon, and then helped Hannah up onto the seat. She settled her skirts just so and folded her hands in her lap, looking almost too calm, like she might break. As they headed out of Reno, following the worn-out road that went north into the high desert, Russell kept catching himself glancing over at his new wife. She sat up straight and still, just watching the scenery pass by with a look on her face he couldn't figure out. The land out here was sparse, but it had its own kind of beauty, with all the sagebrush and rocky hills, and the mountains off in the distance looking like sleeping giants. "This is very different from Boston," Hannah said at last, breaking the long silence. "Back there, everything is green and feels crowded. Out here, the sky just feels like it goes on forever." "It takes some getting used to," Russell admitted, "but there's a real freedom in all this open space. You have room to breathe and build, something that's all your own." "Is that what you've done? Built something of your own?" Hannah asked. "My father and we built it together," Russell said. "He came out west back in '62 during the big mining boom. He tried his luck with silver over in Virginia City, but he figured out the real money was in feeding the miners. So he started the ranch to supply them with beef. By the time I came along, he had a good operation going. I've been working that ranch since I was big enough to stay on a horse." "He sounds like he was a practical man," Hannah noted. "Practical as they come," Russell agreed. "Which is why this whole marriage rule in his will shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did. He always believed a man needed a family to make his work mean something." "And what do you believe?" Hannah asked, turning to look him straight in the eye. Russell thought about her question for a moment. "I believe a ranch needs folks who care about it to survive. Whether that's a family in the old-fashioned sense, or just people pulling together for the same goal, I'm not sure. But I reckon we're about to find out." They rode the rest of the way in silence until the Say Ranch finally came into view. The main house was set up on a small hill. It was a solid-looking place made of wood and stone, with a big front porch and a sloped roof built to handle the heavy snows they sometimes got. Behind it were the barn, the corral, a bunkhouse, and all the other buildings you'd expect to see on a working cattle ranch. Smoke was curling up from the chimney of a smaller house about 100 yards away, which Russell pointed out is the foreman's place. "That's where Miguel and Maria Torres live with their kids," Russell explained. "Miguel's been with us for 12 years. He's the best horseman in Nevada and keeps the whole place running day to day. Maria is a miracle worker with food and medicine. Their children, Alina and Pablo, are 7 and 9. You'll like them." Hannah just stared, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's simple, but it's beautiful." Russell helped her down from the wagon and then carried her trunk inside the house. The place was clean, but it was obvious no woman lived there. It was all practical furniture and bare walls. The main room was a combination living room and dining room with a big stone fireplace along one wall. The kitchen was off to the left, and a hallway on the right led back to the bedrooms. "Your room is this way," Russell said, leading her down the hall. He opened the door to the bigger of the 2 spare bedrooms. It faced east, so it would get the morning sun. The room was simple, with just a bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. "I know it's not much," he said, "but you can fix it up however you want. There's money set aside for the household, so you can order whatever you need from the mercantile in town." Hannah put her little purse on the chair and turned to him. "Mr. Whitmore, I want to be perfectly clear about one thing. I plan to hold up my end of our deal completely. I will run your house and act as your wife whenever we're in public. But I also need you to know how much I appreciate your honesty. I've had enough lies and tricks to last me a lifetime. Whatever this arrangement turns into, I'm glad it started with the truth. I feel the exact same way, Russell said. And maybe we could drop the formal stuff. You can call me Russell, and I'll call you Hannah if that's all right with you. That's acceptable, Hannah agreed. And for the very first time since he had met her, she gave him a real, full smile. It completely changed her face, bringing a warmth to her that had been hidden behind a wall of tension. Russell felt something shift inside his chest. He realized his new wife was more than just an answer to a problem in a will. She was a real person, with her own story of hurts and hopes, and he had just tied his life to hers in a way neither of them could possibly see the end of. Over the next few days, Hannah settled into life on the ranch with a quiet competence that took Russell by surprise. She went through all the household supplies, reorganized the kitchen the way she liked it, and got a routine going that brought some real order to the mess Russell had been living in since his father passed. Maria Torres came up to the main house on the second day and hit it off with Hannah right away. "It is so good to have another woman here," Maria said with her pleasant accent as she helped Hannah make bread. "Russell is a good man, but he has been living like a bear in a cave. This house needed a woman's care." Hannah kneaded the dough like she'd been doing it her whole life. "I am still learning my way around." This place was a world away from everything she'd ever known back east. Maria just smiled and told her, "You will get the hang of it. And you listen here. If you find yourself needing a single thing, you come straight to me. Folks look after their own out here. It is the only way we make it." From the hallway where he had come in for his midday meal, Russell heard them talking and felt a real sense of warmth spread through his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this whole setup was going to turn out all right. He had to give it to Hannah. She was adapting to the rhythm of ranch life with a grit he couldn't help but admire. But later, when the house was quiet and he was lying in his own bed, Russell was becoming more and more aware of his new wife just down the hall. He could hear the soft sounds of her getting ready for bed, and his mind painted pictures that had no business being in a practical arrangement. He reminded himself, hard, that he had given his word. Nothing would happen unless they both wanted it to. His body, however, did not seem to care much for the promises his head had made. For her part, Hannah was wrestling with her own brand of confusion. The man she married, Russell Whitmore, was not the man she had braced herself for. He was always a gentleman, waking up before the sun to fetch wood for the stove, making sure the kitchen was warm for her when she came to cook breakfast. He would ask her thoughts on running the house, and then he would actually pay attention to what she said. He worked long, hard hours wrestling this ranch into shape, but he never missed a meal she cooked. He always had a good word for her cooking and asked how her day had gone. He was not a bit like James, that slick banker from Boston who wooed her with sweet talk and empty vows, only to disappear the second her father's business went under. And he was certainly nothing like Martin, the snake oil salesman who tricked her into coming west with talk of marriage, conveniently forgetting to mention the wife he already had. Russell was honest, dependable, and kinder than she ever expected. Hannah found herself watching him when he was not looking, admiring the confident way he carried himself and how his hands, rough and calloused from work, could be so gentle with the horses. About 2 weeks after they were married, Russell got news that cattle thieves were hitting ranches in the area. One of their neighbors had lost 50 head of cattle to rustlers who came like ghosts in the night and vanished back into the mountains. Russell called a meeting with Miguel and his 4 most trusted ranch hands, men who had been with him for years, to talk about tightening up security. From the kitchen where she was putting together supper, Hannah heard every word. A cold dread coiled in her gut at the very idea of Russell facing down a bunch of dangerous men. She never figured she would care one way or another if her husband by contract made it home safe, but it seemed her heart hadn't bothered to read the fine print of their deal. That evening, she found herself knocking on Russell's bedroom door. He opened it, looking plain surprised to see her. He had taken off his work shirt and was just in his undershirt and trousers, his dark hair still damp from washing up. He asked her, "Hannah, is everything all right?" "I needed to talk to you about these rustlers," she said, forcing herself to look at his face and not at the way his undershirt fit across the strong lines of his chest. "Are you really planning to go after them yourself?" "If I have to," Russell said. "It is my job to protect this ranch and our herd." "It is also your job to stay alive," Hannah shot back, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "What good is this ranch if you end up dead?" Russell's expression went soft. "Are you worried about me, Hannah?" She tilted her chin up, trying to look tough. "I am worried about this house. If something were to happen to you, I would be right back where I started, with not a thing to my name and nowhere to call home." It was not the whole truth, and the air between them crackled with what was left unsaid. But Russell just gave a slow nod. "I will be careful, I give you my word. Miguel and I, we have handled rustlers before. We know how to defend what is ours without being reckless." "You just make sure you do," Hannah said. She turned and hurried back to her room before he could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She was not supposed to feel this way. This was just supposed to be a practical deal, and that was all. But somewhere in the middle of cooking his meals, running his house, and listening to him talk about his dreams for this land, she had gone and started to care, and it scared her to death. The rustlers came 3 nights later. Russell and Miguel had the men taking turns on night watch. And it was young Tom Hicks who saw them first, shadows moving down by the southern pasture. He fired a shot in the air to sound the alarm and rode like the wind for the main house. Russell had his rifle in hand and was out the door before Hannah even knew what was happening. She stood there on the porch in her nightgown and robe, just watching as Russell and 4 of his men galloped off into the blackness. Maria came and stood right next to her, pulling a shawl around Hannah's shoulders. "They will be just fine," Maria said, her voice full of conviction. "Miguel has seen worse, and so has Russell. Those are 2 smart men. But smart men can still catch a bullet," Hannah thought. The next 2 hours felt like the longest of her entire life. She and Maria waited in the kitchen, keeping the coffee pot hot and fighting off the terrible images in their minds. When they finally heard the sound of approaching horses, the 2 women nearly fell over each other, rushing to the door. Russell swung down from his horse, looking stiff. In the lamplight pouring out of the house, Hannah saw the dark stain of blood on his sleeve. She was off the porch and down the stairs before she even told her feet to move. "You are hurt," she said, her hand reaching for his arm. "It is just a scratch," Russell told her, but his face was chalk white. "One of them got a shot off before they took off running. We chased them away and got back the cattle they were trying to run off. Get inside right now," Hannah ordered. And Russell found himself doing exactly what his wife said. She sat him down at the kitchen table while Maria went to get the medicine box. Working together, they cleaned and bandaged the wound on Russell's upper arm. It was a nasty graze from a bullet that had ripped through his shirt and carved a bloody line in his skin. "You told me you would be careful," Hannah said, and she hated the way her voice was shaking. "They scattered at the first sign of a real fight," Russell said. "I was careful, Hannah. This is not a big deal." "It is not nothing," Hannah said with a fire in her eyes, tying the bandage tighter than she needed to. "You could have been killed." Russell reached out and took her hand, making her stop her fidgeting. "But I was not. I am sitting right here, and I am all right. Hannah, look at me." When she finally lifted her gaze to his, he could see the tears she was trying so hard to hold back. "I did not mean to scare you like that," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I am sorry." "I do not have any right to be scared," Hannah whispered. "This is a business deal. I should not care if you come home or not." "Should not?" Russell repeated, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "But you do." It was a statement, not a question. Hannah snatched her hand back and stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "I will get some fresh coffee started. The men will be wanting some." She made herself busy at the stove, turning her back to him, and he let the matter drop. But something had changed for good between them that night. You could feel it in the air. The lines they had drawn so carefully were starting to fade. In the weeks that followed, spring finally came to the high desert for real. The sagebrush bloomed in a haze of silver green, and wildflowers popped up in the most surprising spots. The cattle got fat on the fresh grass, and Russell's arm healed up clean, leaving a scar that Hannah's eyes always seemed to find when he rolled his sleeves up to work. They settled into a comfortable kind of partnership. Hannah, it turned out, had a real knack for numbers, and soon took over the ranch's books, even finding a few ways to cut their expenses without cutting corners. Russell learned that she had a special touch with the horses, a quiet confidence that the animals just seemed to understand. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch after supper, just watching the sun dip behind the mountains and talking about anything and everything. Russell told her about what it was like growing up on this very ranch, about his mother who passed when he was only 12, and about the year he spent in San Francisco studying business before he knew for sure his heart was here on this land. Hannah told him about her own childhood in Boston, about her parents who loved her more than anything but always struggled to make ends meet. She told him about the education her father made sure she got, no matter what it cost them. He always said a woman ought to be able to think for herself, Hannah explained one night, as they watched the first stars appear in the giant Nevada sky. He was not like most men back then. His friends all thought teaching a daughter to read and write was a waste of money. He was a smart man, Russell said. You have one of the sharpest minds I've ever come across. The changes you have made to our bookkeeping alone are going to save us a good deal of money this year. A warmth bloomed deep in Hannah's chest at his praise. I just like having something useful to do. In Boston, all I was ever supposed to be was pretty. Here, I feel like I can actually contribute. You contribute more than you know, Russell said quietly. And there was a tone in his voice that made Hannah turn her head and really look at him. In the fading light, his face was mostly in shadow, but she could feel his eyes locked on hers. Russell, she started to say, though she had no idea what would come next. He reached over and took her hand. He placed his hand over hers where it was resting on the arm of the chair. His palm felt warm and rough against her skin. He said, Hannah, I know we started this whole thing as a business deal, but I need you to understand that you have become more to me than just some convenient answer to a problem. You have become important. Your happiness means something to me. Hannah felt her breath catch in her throat. It means a great deal, Russell said. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss right on her knuckles. That simple gesture felt more personal than anything else they had shared up to that point. I will not pressure you. Our deal is still our deal, just like we made it. But I wanted you to know that if you ever decide you want something more out of this marriage, I would welcome it with open arms. Hannah's heart was pounding inside her chest. For weeks now, she had been fighting back the feelings she was starting to have for Russell. She kept telling herself it was just plain foolish to fall for a man who only married her because he had to. But here he was, telling her that what started out of necessity had grown into something much deeper. I think, she said, choosing her words with care, that I might want more. But I am scared, Russell. I have been hurt in the past. I have put my trust in men who showed me they were not worthy of it. I know, Russell said in a gentle voice, and I cannot promise that I will never cause you pain or let you down because I am only a man. But what I can promise you is that I will never, ever knowingly lie to you. What I am feeling for you is real, Hannah. It might not be what either of us had planned on, but it is as real as this land. She gave his hand a little squeeze, a quiet way of saying she understood his words. They sat there together as the evening darkness settled around them, holding hands like a couple of young kids courting. And Hannah felt a part of her heart that had been locked up and guarded begin to slowly, carefully, creak open. The very next morning, Miguel came riding in from the northern pasture. He brought news that one of the breeding cows was having a hard time giving birth. Russell saddled his horse right away. And to her own surprise, Hannah heard herself asking if she could go with him. It is not going to be a pleasant sight, Russell warned her. Births can be tough and messy. I would still like to learn, Hannah insisted. If I am going to be a real part of this ranch, I ought to understand every part of it. So Russell helped her up onto one of the more gentle mares, and they rode out with Miguel. The cow was truly in a bad way, moaning a pitiful sound as she struggled with a calf that was not turned the right way. Russell knelt down in the dry grass next to her, talking in a calm voice as he checked on the situation. "The calf is breech," he said to Miguel. "We are going to have to turn it." What happened next was a solid hour of difficult, careful work. Russell took off his outer shirt, leaving him in his undershirt, and reached inside the cow. His face was tight with focus as he felt around for the calf's position. Miguel held the cow's head, trying to keep her as calm as he could. Hannah found herself standing there holding Russell's coat and hat, whispering words of encouragement, though she was not quite sure if she was talking to the cow, the calf, or to Russell himself. At last, with a great gush of fluid and one final heaving push from the worn-out mother, the calf slipped out and into Russell's waiting hands. He quickly cleared its nose and mouth. After a moment that made her heart stop, the little thing took a gasping breath and started breathing on its own. The mother cow immediately turned toward her baby, mooing softly, and starting to lick it clean with her rough tongue. Russell sat back on his heels, covered in afterbirth and blood, and grinned with a look of pure, fierce satisfaction. "We did it. They are both going to be just fine." Hannah found herself grinning right back at him, swept up in the powerful joy of seeing new life. "And a hard fight won." "You were incredible." "We were incredible," Russell corrected her, even though Hannah had not done much more than stand and watch. "This is what it means to be a rancher, Hannah. Fighting for every single life, every birth, every season. It is hard, hard work. But it matters." Watching him sitting there in the grass, exhausted and filthy, but absolutely glowing with the victory of saving 2 lives, Hannah felt the very last of her walls come tumbling down. She was in love with her husband. She was completely and forever in love with this man who had married her as a practical solution, and had somehow become the very center of her whole world. They rode back to the ranch house in the warmth of the spring morning. When they reached the porch, Russell swung down from his horse and then helped Hannah down. But instead of letting her go right away, he kept her there, his hands on her waist, and looked down at her with an expression that stole her breath. "Hannah," he said, and the way her name sounded on his lips was like a prayer. "Yes," she whispered, not entirely sure what she was saying yes to, but knowing in her heart that it was for everything. He kissed her then. He truly kissed her for the very first time since their wedding day. His lips were warm and a little chapped from the sun and the wind, and that kiss tasted of new beginnings and promises. Hannah's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, solid man beneath her palms, and she kissed him back with all the emotion she had been trying so hard to keep locked away. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Russell rested his forehead against hers. "I am a complete mess," he said with a shaky laugh. "I should not have done that before getting cleaned up." "I do not care," Hannah said, and she truly meant it. "Russell, there is something I need you to know. For me, this stopped being just a business deal weeks ago. I tried to fight it. I tried to keep my heart safe, but I cannot do it anymore. I have gone and fallen in love with you." She felt him become completely still against her. Then his arms wrapped tighter around her waist, and he lifted her clear off her feet in a powerful hug. "Say that again," he demanded. "I love you," Hannah repeated, laughing now, even as tears of joy streamed down her face. "I love you, Russell Whitmore. And it is both terrifying and wonderful at the same time." "I love you too," Russell said. He set her down gently and held her face in his hands, not seeming to care one bit that he was getting her clean dress all dirty. "I think I have been halfway in love with you since that very first night in the saloon. When you looked at me with those amazing eyes and said yes to the craziest proposal ever made. But I did not want to push you. I did not want you to feel like you had to." "I do not feel like I have to," Hannah promised him. "I feel blessed. I came out west searching for a home, and I found that. But I also found something I never ever expected. I found a man who sees me as a true partner, someone who values my thoughts just as much as my company. I found you." They just stood there on the porch, holding one another, until Maria's voice drifted up from her little house, calling out something to one of the children. Russell let Hannah go with some reluctance and took a step back. "I really need to wash up," he said. "But tonight after supper, would you be willing to take a walk with me? There is something I want to show you." "I would like that very much," Hannah agreed. That evening, after a meal that Hannah could barely taste even though she had cooked it herself, Russell took her by the hand and led her away from the ranch house. They walked through the sagebrush as the sun. It started its downward path, following a trail that opened up to a small hill overlooking the whole ranch. From this vantage point, Hannah could take in the main house, the barns, the corral holding their horses, and the sprawling rangeland that rolled on toward mountains in the distance. Russell told her, "This is my favorite spot on this entire place. I come up here when I have to do some serious thinking or need to be reminded of why I am doing all of this." Hannah took in the whole beautiful scene and said, "It is just breathtaking." The light from the setting sun was painting everything in hues of gold and deep purple. Russell went on, "When my mother passed away, my father brought me right here. He explained to me that this land would be here long after we were gone, but what we chose to do while we were here was what truly mattered. He believed the measure of a man's life was not in what he gathered for himself, but in what he built for others to use when he was gone." I did not quite catch his meaning until I got a bit older. Hannah leaned against his side, and he naturally wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "And now," he said, "now I get it." He was talking about a legacy. Not just about land or things, but about the lives we touch and the folks we look after. This ranch is more than just dirt and cattle. It is a home for Miguel and Maria and their kids. It gives good work to the ranch hands and their families. It puts beef on tables for communities all over Nevada. This place matters for more reasons than just my own." Hannah observed, "Your father was a very wise man, even if his ideas for making sure you got married were a little unconventional." Russell let out a laugh. "I said some mighty harsh words about him when I first heard what was in that will, but now I believe I understand what he was trying to teach me. The ranch needed a person who would care for it like a home, not just a piece of property. It needed you." "I needed it too," Hannah confessed. "I was looking for a place where I could feel like I belonged, where I could do something that felt important. I needed a purpose." Russell turned to look at her straight on and asked, "And now? What is it you need now, Hannah?" She raised her hand to his face, gently tracing the strong line of his jaw with her fingers. "Now I need you. Just you, Russell, that is all I need." That, he kissed her one more time as the sun dipped below the horizon, splashing the sky with brilliant colors of orange and pink. By the time they walked back to the ranch house, holding hands, everything was different between them. They were no longer two strangers held together by a practical arrangement. They had become partners, companions, and something else that neither one of them had really allowed themselves to hope for. They were two people who had fallen genuinely and deeply in love. That very night, Hannah gathered her things and moved them into Russell's room. He helped her carry her few dresses and personal belongings from her room to his. After everything was put away, they stood together next to the bed they would from now on share. "Are you sure about this?" Russell asked, giving her one final chance to change her mind. "I am more sure about this than I have ever been about anything in my whole life," Hannah answered. And she meant every single word of it. Their wedding night, which had been put off for weeks filled with careful thought and growing feelings, was tender and sweet. Russell was so gentle with her, taking his time to show her with his touch, not just his words, how much he truly cherished her. Hannah found out that the powerful connection between them went far beyond just getting along and being friends. It was something physical and incredibly deep. They just fit together in mind, body, and spirit, in a way that felt like a pure miracle. Afterward, as she lay in Russell's arms with her head resting on his chest and his fingers gently combing through her loose hair, Hannah felt a profound sense of peace wash over her like a warm blanket. "I always thought love was supposed to be a complicated mess," she whispered. "All those books I used to read back in Boston made it out to be this heart-wrenching drama, full of big mistakes and over-the-top gestures." Russell's chest rumbled with a quiet laugh right under her ear. "I reckon we had our share of drama just getting to this point, but maybe the best kind of love is the kind that feels simple once you quit fighting it. The kind that feels like you have finally come home." "Yes," Hannah agreed. "Just like coming home." The summer flew by in a happy haze of hard work and quiet joy. Hannah dove headfirst into learning every single thing she could about running a ranch. She even helped with the branding that spring, which was a source of great amusement for the ranch hands, who had never laid eyes on a lady with a Boston education working cattle before. She got good enough at riding to go with Russell on his daily rounds, checking on fences and water holes all across their massive property. She worked side by side with Maria in the garden, growing the vegetables that would feed them all through the coming winter. But more than all the work, she cherished the quiet little moments of closeness with Russell, sharing a cup of coffee on the porch before the day's chores began. A quick kiss stolen in the barn when they just happened to be there at the same time. Evenings spent in a comfortable quiet with Hannah reading a book by the lamplight while Russell worked on the ranch accounts or fixed a piece of tack. And nights spent held tight in each other's arms, learning the maps of each other's bodies and hearts. In July, a lawyer made the trip out from Reno to the ranch. Hannah felt a quick jolt of worry, thinking there might be some new problem with their marriage or with Russell's claim to the ranch. But this lawyer, a different man from the one who had read the will from Russell's father, was just there for Russell to sign a few documents. They were to confirm he was a married man and was still operating the ranch. "Everything looks to be in order, Mr. Whitmore," the lawyer said as Russell put his signature on the papers. "Your father's terms have been met. The ranch is now legally and entirely yours with no more strings attached." After the lawyer had gone, Russell turned to Hannah with a big grin. "We did it. The ranch is safe." "We certainly did," Hannah agreed. But instead of the relief she thought she would feel, she felt a strange wave of sadness come over her. "Russell, now that the terms of your father's will have been satisfied, what does this mean for our marriage?" Russell looked at her, completely puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, you married me so you could keep the ranch," Hannah said, choosing her words with care. "Now that you have done that, do you want things to be different between us?" The understanding washed over Russell's face, and right behind it came a look that was close to pure panic. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and grabbed her hands with his. "Hannah Whitmore, you look at me. It is true that I married you to keep this ranch, but I fell in love with you because of the person you are, because you are smarter than anyone I know and brave, and you make me laugh, because you care about this land and the people who live on it just as much as I do, because I cannot even think about waking up in the morning without you there or getting through a single day without seeing your face. The ranch might have been what brought us together, but it is not what is keeping us together. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Hannah could feel tears welling up in her eyes. "I just needed to hear you say it. I needed to know that you still wanted me for me, not just because I helped you check a box on some legal paper. I want you," Russell said with absolute certainty. "Today, tomorrow, and for every single day for the rest of our lives. You are my wife, Hannah. And that is not because of a document or some lawyer's papers. It is because you are the person I choose every single day." She kissed him right then, putting all of her relief and love and promise into that one kiss. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling up at him through her tears. "I choose you too, every single day." That fall, they faced the first real challenge to their new partnership. A dry spell that had been growing all summer long got much worse, and the streams and ponds that normally watered the ranch started to disappear. Russell and Miguel spent long days in the saddle, riding all over the property, checking the situation and making hard choices about which pastures to give up on and where to move the herds to find what little water was left. Hannah took charge of talking with the other ranchers in the area, organizing ways to share what they had and pass along information. She wrote letters to farming experts down in California, asking for any advice they had on surviving a drought. She worked with Maria to can and preserve every last bit of food they could grow, because she knew that if they had to sell off cattle early due to the drought, money would be awful tight through the winter. On one especially tough evening, Russell came walking in after a 14-hour day on horseback. He found Hannah still up, working on the account books by the light of a lamp on the kitchen table. He could see the worry carved into her face as she added up columns of numbers that probably were not looking the way she wanted them to. "Come on to bed," he said softly, putting his arms around her from behind. "Those numbers will still be there in the morning." "We are going to have to sell more cattle than we planned," Hannah said, and her voice was strained with frustration. "Even if it started raining tomorrow, we have already lost too many water sources to keep the herd this big." "I know," Russell said. "I have been trying not to face it, but you are right. We will drive 200 head to market next week instead of the 100 we had planned. It will be enough to get us through to the spring." Hannah turned around in his arms to look up at him. "I just hate seeing you work this hard only to have the weather tear it all down. That is of ranching," Russell said with a tired smile. "We are always at the mercy of things we cannot control. But we figure it out. We survive, and we come back even stronger. We will make it through this, Hannah, together." And they did just that. The cattle drive to the market was exhausting, but Russell managed to get a fair price for the herd. They had to be careful with their money through the winter, making every single dollar stretch as far as it could go. And when spring finally arrived, it brought with it a blessed rain that filled the streams and the water holes. They were able to start rebuilding. More than that, the drought had shown both of them that their partnership was stronger than any problem they might ever face. They had worked side by side, supported each other, and came out of it with their love and dedication, not just whole, but even deeper. In May of 1883, just a little over a year after their strange wedding, Hannah found out she was pregnant. She waited until she was absolutely sure before she told Russell, not wanting to get his hopes up too soon. But when she finally told him over breakfast one morning, his reaction was everything she could have wished for. He just stared at her for a long moment, his coffee cup frozen, halfway to his mouth. Then he set the cup down very carefully, stood up from his chair, and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around and around the kitchen while laughing like a wild man. "We are having a baby?" he asked when he finally put her down. "We are really having a baby?" "Sometime in late November or early December, based on my figuring," Hannah confirmed, laughing at how excited he was. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Russell cupped her face in his hands, and his eyes were shining with emotion. "Hannah, I am way beyond happy. I am thrilled. I am terrified. I am so many things I cannot even put a name to them all. But more than anything, I'm grateful. Grateful for you, for this life we are building, and for this family we are starting." The pregnancy was not an easy one. Hannah had terrible morning sickness all through the summer, and the Nevada heat made her feel miserable and cranky. But Russell was a rock for her, always patient and supportive. He brought her cool water whenever she needed it, changed his work schedule so he could be closer to the house when she was feeling her worst, and he would rub her swollen feet in the evenings while she laughed about how big she was getting. Maria was a true blessing, having gone through pregnancy 2 times herself. She gave Hannah a good idea of what was coming, explaining what was perfectly normal and what might be a reason to worry. Maria assured her that every feeling she had was completely natural. "That morning, sickness will pass," Maria would promise. "And after that, you're going to feel better than you ever have in your life. You will just wait and see." The second part of a pregnancy is a beautiful thing. And Maria was right on the money. By September, Hannah's queasy stomach had settled down, and she moved into a time where she felt full of energy and strength. Even with her belly growing, she kept on running the house and managing the ranch's books. She flat out refused to be treated like she was fragile just because a baby was on the way. "I am pregnant, not sick," she told Russell when he tried to stop her from hanging the laundry. "I have got to stay active." "I know," Russell said, holding his hands up like he was surrendering. "But you have to let me worry just a little bit, would you? You are carrying the most precious cargo in all of Nevada." In early December, when the first real bite of winter settled on the ranch, Hannah's labor began. Russell sent Miguel flying to Reno to get the doctor, while Maria came over to the main house to help out. The labor was long and hard, stretching through the whole night and into the next day. Russell wore a path in the hallway floor outside their bedroom, wanting desperately to be with Hannah, but respecting Maria's firm belief that he would just be in the way. At last, late in the afternoon of December 6th, his son was born. Maria came out of the bedroom with a huge smile and told Russell he could go on in. He walked in to find Hannah propped up on pillows, worn out but glowing, holding a little bitty bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," she said in a soft voice. Russell walked over to the bed, his legs a bit shaky, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out of the blankets. The baby had dark hair, just like his own, and eyes that might one day be Hannah's gray-green, though it was tough to tell in the soft lamplight. He was just perfect. "Can I hold him?" Russell asked, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah gently passed the baby into Russell's arms. He held his son with that same gentle confidence he used with newborn calves, supporting the tiny head and nestling the small body against his chest. "He is beautiful," Russell whispered. "Hannah, he is just absolutely beautiful." "He is ours," Hannah said, reaching up to touch Russell's face. "Our son, our family." They named him James, after Hannah's father, with Russell as his middle name. Jamie, as they nicknamed him, turned out to be a healthy, hungry little fellow who kept them both awake at night, wanting to be fed. But neither one of them cared about the lost sleep. They would take turns walking the floor with Jamie, calming him down when he got fussy, just staring at his tiny fingers and toes and feeling their hearts swell in ways they never knew they could. Sometimes, watching Russell with their son, Hannah would find her mind wandering back to that night in the Golden Sage Saloon. A desperate rancher had offered a marriage of convenience to a desperate woman who had nowhere else to go. She would remember the fear and the not knowing what would happen, the careful space they kept between them in those first few weeks, and it would feel nearly impossible that those two worn-out strangers had become the family they were now. "What are you thinking about?" Russell asked her one evening, as they sat together by the fire with Jaime sleeping in a cradle that Miguel had built for them as a gift. "About how far we have come," Hannah said. "About how this whole thing started as a business deal and turned into something I never in my wildest dreams thought was possible." Russell reached over and took her hand, weaving his fingers through hers in a way that had become as natural to them as breathing. "My father would have loved you. He would have loved knowing that his strange will was what brought us together." "You think he planned it?" Hannah asked. "Do you think he somehow knew that forcing you to get married would lead to all this?" "I think he was a practical man who knew that I needed someone to share my life with," Russell said, thinking it over. "Whether he meant for it to be a true love match, I could not say. But I like to think that wherever he is mighty pleased with how things turned out." "I am pleased with how things turned out," Hannah said. "I came out west thinking I was running away from loss and disappointment. But I was actually running toward this, toward you, toward our life together, toward our family. I was running toward home." Russell lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. "You are home, Hannah. You will always be home to me." The years that came after were not always easy. There were tough winters and summers with no rain. There were cattle losses and markets that went up and down, and the never-ending work of keeping up and growing the ranch. But through every bit of it, Russell and Hannah faced it all side by side, their partnership just getting stronger as each season went by. They had two more children, a daughter named Margaret in 1885, and another son, Thomas, in 1888. The main house that had once seemed so big when Hannah first got there started to feel full of life and noise and the beautiful racket of a growing family. Maria and Miguel's children grew up right alongside the Whitmore children, making a community on the ranch that felt more like one big extended family. Alina Torres and Margaret Whitmore became the best of friends, thick as thieves. Young Pablo took Jaime and Thomas under his wing, teaching them how to ride and rope and work with the cattle. Russell slowly grew the ranch operations, buying up the land next door when it came up for sale, and building the herd back to a healthy size. As the children got older, Hannah took on even more responsibility, not just running the household, but becoming a full partner in every decision on the ranch. Her education and sharp mind for business were a huge help time and time again, and Russell came to rely on her judgment just as much as he did his own. Depended on Miguel's know-how with the cattle and horses. Back in 1892, on a warm spring evening, that felt just like the one where Russell first told Hannah he loved her, they took a walk up to his favorite spot overlooking the ranch. The little ones were all tucked in and fast asleep, with Maria keeping a watchful eye, giving them a few precious hours, all to themselves. 10 years, Hannah said, her gaze sweeping over the land that had come to mean so much to her. Can you believe it's really been 10 years since that night in the saloon? 10 years since I made the best deal of my whole life, Russell agreed. 10 years since I offered you the wildest marriage proposal in all of Nevada. Hannah let out a soft laugh. I figure there have been some wilder ones, but ours surely had a strange start and the finest ending you could ask for, Russell added. He drew her in close, and she laid her head on his shoulder, feeling the strong, steady presence of him, as comforting now as it was in those first uncertain days. Do you ever wonder what might have been if things had turned out different? Hannah asked softly. If I'd said no that night, if you'd gone and found somebody else. Never, Russell said, his voice sure and steady. I believe we were always meant to find our way to each other, Hannah. Maybe it was my father's will that pointed us in the right direction, or maybe it was just fate, or maybe we were just luckier than two bugs in a rug. But however it happened, I thank my lucky stars for it every single day. Hannah lifted her face to his, and he kissed her with that familiar fire that had only grown stronger over a decade of being married. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling up at him. I'm thankful too, she whispered. I came out west looking for a place to call home, and I found a whole lot more. I found a purpose and a partner. I found a place where I could just be me. I found a love that changed my whole world. We found each other, Russell said, plain and simple. Everything else just grew right out of that. They stood there together on that hillside as the first stars started popping out in the big Nevada sky, holding on to each other and watching over the ranch that brought them together and the family they had raised. Behind them, the lights from the main house glowed, warm and inviting. A little curl of smoke rose from the chimney of Miguel and Maria's place. Down in the corral, the horses shifted quiet-like in the growing dark. This wasn't the life either of them had ever planned on or expected. It had all started with hard times and pure need, with two strangers making a pact that first night in a saloon down in Reno. But from that unlikely start, something truly special had grown. A real partnership, a love that ran deep and true, and a family that would keep their story going for years and years to come. Hannah Erickson had been desperate for a home. Russell Whitmore had been desperate for a wife to help him keep his ranch. They made a deal, and by keeping that deal, they ended up with everything they ever really needed. They had found each other, and in doing that, they had found a love that turned a simple arrangement into a romance that would last them the rest of their days. As they walked back down to the ranch house holding hands, the future stretched out ahead of them, looking bright and full of promise. There would be more tough times ahead, you could bet on that. More hard seasons and hard choices to make. But there would also be more laughter filling up the dinner table, more children growing up strong on this land they cherished, more evenings spent side by side watching the sun dip behind the mountains, and more mornings waking up next to each other, just thankful for another day together. The ranch that Russell had fought so hard to hold on to had become something more than just land or a legacy. It had become the very ground for a family built on trust, a true partnership, and a love that had snuck up on both of them with its strength and its power to last. And every single time Hannah looked at Russell, every time he reached for her hand or smiled at her from across a busy room. She remembered that night in the Golden Sage Saloon when two folks at the end of their rope took a big chance on each other. It was the best bet either of them had ever made, and they would spend all their remaining years feeling grateful for the nerve it took to say yes to a future they couldn't see, one that turned out to be more beautiful than anything they could have dreamed up. Their love story had started out of necessity, for goodness sake, but it had bloomed into something magnificent, proving that sometimes the most sensible choices can lead a person to the most wonderful kind of happiness. And so they lived, and they worked, and they loved, and they built their life together on that Nevada ranch. Two people who had started out as strangers tied by a bargain became partners tied by love, creating a family legacy that would stand long after they were laid to rest. Their children would grow up listening to the story of how their mama and papa met, about the strange proposal and the marriage of convenience that turned into the realest kind of love match. And they would learn that the best things in this life often show up when you take a leap of faith on something that seems impossible. Russell and Hannah Whitmore had needed each other in a practical way, but they grew to want each other in ways that had nothing to do with being practical. They had built more than a ranch. They had built a home. More than a marriage, they had built a partnership. More than a family, they had built a legacy of love that showed the human heart could find something beautiful and true in the most unlikely of places. And that, in the end, was the greatest thing they ever did.